January 17, 1945. The Siegfried Line, Western Germany. The snow falls in silence across the dark teeth of concrete and steel that stretch like a scar across the German frontier. Bunkers crouch low against the frozen earth, their gun slits staring westward like the hollow eyes of sentinels who have stood watch too long. Inside one of these fortifications, a young Wehrmacht soldier, barely 19, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold, runs his fingers along the thick concrete wall. 3 feet of reinforced stone and iron. He has been told it is impenetrable. He has been told that these walls, these trenches, these interlocking fields of fire represent the final word in defensive engineering. The West Wall, the Siegfried Line, the shield of the Fatherland. Outside, the wind carries the distant rumble of engines. American engines. The sound grows steadily, like approaching thunder, and with it comes a trembling in the earth that the young soldier can feel through the soles of his boots. He tightens his grip on his Carabiner 98K rifle and glances at his sergeant, an older man whose face bears the lines of Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. The sergeant says nothing. He merely stares at the gun slit, listening to that mechanical thunder grow closer, knowing what the young soldier does not yet understand, that concrete and faith are not the same thing, and that the Americans are coming with something the planners of the Siegfried Line never truly accounted for. Not just tanks, but industrial capacity married to tactical fury, abundance wedded to audacity. And at the head of this armored avalanche, a general who believes that fortifications are merely obstacles to be driven through, not barriers to be respected. The Siegfried Line was never supposed to fall. Not like this. Not so quickly. Not so completely. To understand the magnitude of what is about to unfold in these frozen weeks of early 1945, one must first understand what the Siegfried Line represented to Germany, not merely as a military structure, but as a psychological fortress, a concrete manifestation of national will. Construction began in 1938 when Hitler, already eyeing the territorial ambitions that would plunge Europe into darkness, ordered the creation of a defensive barrier along Germany's western frontier. The West Wall, as the Germans called it, stretched more than 390 miles from Cleve near the Netherlands to the Swiss border, a serpentine system of bunkers, tank traps, minefields, and dragon's teeth, those pyramid-shaped concrete obstacles designed to stop armored vehicles in their tracks. By 1940, after the fall of France, the Siegfried Line had become a propaganda symbol, immortalized in the song, "Wir fahren gegen England," and celebrated in newsreels as the impregnable wall of German defense. More than 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and tunnel complexes had been constructed, many reinforced with steel-reinforced concrete walls up to 3 meters thick. The interlocking fields of fire were designed by military engineers who had studied every lesson of the First World War, creating kill zones where any attacking force would be subjected to withering crossfire from multiple positions simultaneously. Anti-tank ditches, some 20 feet deep, snaked through the landscape. Millions of mines were planted in geometric precision. The entire system was designed on the principle that any attacking army would exhaust itself against these defenses, bleeding strength and morale until the offensive collapsed under its own weight. For 4 years after France fell, the Siegfried Line stood largely unmanned, a dormant giant guarding a border that seemed secure. German attention turned eastward to the vast steppes of Russia and the brutal calculations of Operation Barbarossa. But by September 1944, as Allied forces surged across France following the Normandy invasion, the Siegfried Line suddenly mattered again. Wehrmacht soldiers, many of them now teenagers or men in their 40s, the prime fighting age men, having been consumed by the Eastern Front's insatiable appetite, were rushed into the bunkers and trenches. They arrived with the assurance that these fortifications would compensate for their lack of experience, that concrete and steel would multiply their effectiveness, that the Americans would break themselves against the West Wall just as French and British armies had broken against German defenses a generation earlier. They believed this because they had to believe it, because the alternative was unthinkable. Lieutenant Hans Mahler, a Wehrmacht officer assigned to a bunker complex near Aachen, wrote in his diary in September 1944, "We are told the Americans will not pass. The walls are too thick, the fields of fire too complete. Our officers speak with confidence, showing us diagrams of how the enemy tanks will be stopped by the dragon's teeth, how their infantry will be cut down before they reach even the first line of defenses. I look at these walls and want to believe. I must believe. There is nothing behind us but the fatherland, and if the West Wall falls, what then?" What Hans Mahler could not know What none of the German defenders could fully grasp was that they were about to face not merely an army, but an industrial juggernaut operating with a material abundance that defied German comprehension. The American Third Army, under the command of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., was not approaching the Siegfried Line with the cautious, methodical tactics of First World War siege warfare. Patton had no interest in prolonged artillery bombardments followed by infantry assaults against prepared positions. He had no patience for the slow grinding down of fortifications through attrition. Patton believed in shock, speed, and the concentrated application of armored force. He believed that fortifications were psychological obstacles as much as physical ones, and that if you hit them hard enough, fast enough, with sufficient violence of action, they would crack. More importantly, Patton had the resources to implement his philosophy. By January 1945, the American industrial machine had reached a peak of productive capacity that was almost incomprehensible. Tanks rolled off assembly lines in Detroit at a rate of one every 30 minutes. Artillery shells were produced by the millions. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, medicine, the entire logistical apparatus of the U.S. military operated with a surplus mentality that seemed almost wasteful to observers accustomed to the scarcity economies of Europe. Inside the Siegfried Line bunkers, German soldiers subsisted on reduced rations, ersatz coffee made from acorns, bread that was more sawdust than flour, occasional tins of preserved meat that might be from France, might be from Czechoslovakia, might be from anywhere the Wehrmacht's dwindling supply network could source provisions. They wore uniforms that had been patched and repatched, boots that had been resoled until the leather was paper thin. Ammunition was rationed. Artillery support was limited by shell shortages. Luftwaffe air cover was a distant memory. The skies belonged to American and British fighters and bombers. And yet they were told to hold. They were told that the fortifications would be enough. The American assault on the Siegfried Line began in earnest in September 1944 with the first probing attacks near Aachen. These initial encounters seemed to confirm German hopes. American infantry divisions, attacking without adequate tank support through the muddy autumn terrain, suffered heavy casualties. The bunkers proved formidable. Machine gun fire from concealed positions cut down advancing troops. Anti-tank guns knocked out Shermans attempting to navigate through the dragon's teeth. For a few weeks, it seemed as though the Siegfried Line might indeed be the barrier that its designers had envisioned. But the Americans learned. They adapted. They brought forward specialized equipment. M4 Sherman tanks fitted with bulldozer blades to push aside obstacles, M4A3E2 jumbo Shermans with extra armor for assault operations, and M12 self-propelled guns capable of reducing bunkers with 155mm shells. They developed tactics for combined arms operations, coordinating infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery in integrated assaults that overwhelmed individual strongpoints before defenders could mutually support each other. They used white phosphorus shells to force German crews out of bunkers, then cut them down with machine gun fire. They used flamethrowers to clear tunnel complexes. They used satchel charges to blow open steel doors. And in January 1945, they brought forward George Patton. Patton's Third Army had been engaged in the Battle of the Bulge, the desperate German counteroffensive through the Ardennes that represented Hitler's last gamble to split the Allied armies. When that offensive collapsed, Patton turned his attention back to the Siegfried Line with the focused intensity of a man who viewed obstacles as personal insults. His plan was characteristically aggressive, multiple armored thrusts along different axes, probing for weak points, then exploiting any breakthrough with rapid penetration into the German rear. He would not siege the Siegfried Line. He would rupture it. On January 17, 1945, as snow continued to fall across the frozen borderlands, Patton's tanks began to roll forward in force. The 10th Armored Division, the 4th Armored Division, elements of the 6th Armored Division, columns of Shermans, half-tracks, tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery stretched back for miles along the approach roads. The sound was immense, a mechanical roar that echoed across the valleys and hills of the frontier region. To the German defenders in their bunkers, peering through gun slits at the approaching armored mass, it must have seemed as though an iron tide was about to break over them. Inside Bunker Complex K-47, a fortification near Irl that controlled a key approach to the German interior, Sergeant Klaus Becker watched the American tanks deploy into assault formation. He had fought in Russia, had seen the T-34s come in waves across the steppes, had survived Stalingrad and the long retreat westward. He knew armor. He knew what tanks could do and what they could not do. Tank destroyers could stop tanks. Minefields could channel tanks. Anti-tank ditches could halt tanks. But what he saw forming up in the valley below was not a tank attack in any traditional sense. It was mobile artillery, a moving wall of steel that advanced not to seize ground but to obliterate resistance, to reduce every bunker to rubble, to make the very concept of static defense obsolete. Becker turned to the young soldier beside him, the same 19-year-old who had taken comfort in the thickness of the concrete walls, and said simply, "They are not going to try to break through. They are going to bury us." The assault began with artillery. American 155mm and 105mm guns, positioned in mass batteries, opened fire in a coordinated barrage that turned the Siegfried Line sector into a landscape of explosions. High explosive shells detonated against bunker walls, not penetrating immediately, but creating cumulative damage, cracking concrete, loosening rebar, creating weak points for subsequent strikes. White phosphorus rounds burst above defensive positions, sending burning chemical streamers into trenches and forcing crews away from weapons. Smoke shells blanketed entire sectors, blinding German observers and breaking up the carefully planned fields of fire. Behind this curtain of fire and smoke, the tanks advanced. Sherman crews had learned that the dragon's teeth, while formidable obstacles, were not indestructible. Engineers moved forward with explosives, blowing gaps in the concrete barriers. Bulldozer-equipped Shermans pushed aside smaller obstacles, creating lanes for following armor. Where anti-tank ditches blocked the advance, combat engineers filled them with rubble, logs, and sandbags, creating improvised bridges that the Shermans could cross. The entire operation moved with a choreographed violence that reflected months of planning and the accumulated lessons of 2 years of combat in Europe. When the tanks reached the bunker line, they did not stop to exchange fire at distance. They rolled directly up to the fortifications, positioning themselves where the bunker's guns could not depress enough to engage them, and began systematic destruction at point-blank range. 75mm main guns fired high-explosive rounds directly into vision slits and embrasures. Machine guns raked any opening. Infantry squads, advancing in the tank's wake, rushed forward with satchel charges and pole charges, placing explosives against steel doors and ventilation shafts. The concussive force of these detonations inside enclosed concrete spaces was devastating. Men's eardrums burst. Lungs collapsed from overpressure. Those who survived the initial blast often surrendered immediately, stumbling out of bunkers with hands raised, blood streaming from their ears and noses, eyes wide with shock. In Bunker Complex K-47, Sergeant Becker's prediction came true. The Americans did not try to storm a position through its firing ports. Instead, a Sherman maneuvered to within 10 feet of the main entrance and began firing directly into the bunker's interior. The first round killed 3 men instantly, the explosion in the confined space turning the concrete walls into a crushing chamber. The second round detonated the bunker's small ammunition stockpile, and suddenly the thick walls that were supposed to protect the defenders became their tomb. Becker, positioned in a secondary chamber, felt the entire structure shudder. Dust and smoke filled the air. The lights, powered by a small generator, flickered and died. In the darkness, he heard men screaming, heard the grinding sound of tank treads directly overhead, heard the ominous silence when the screaming stopped. He surrendered. He and the 7 men still alive in his section emerged from a ventilation shaft with white flags fashioned from torn undershirts. American infantrymen secured them quickly, efficiently, without malice, but also without gentleness. Becker looked back at the bunker that was supposed to be impregnable and saw smoke rising from its shattered entrance. The walls were still standing, but it did not matter. The walls had not saved anyone. What the German defenders experienced in those January days was not merely military defeat, but a confrontation with a form of warfare that their doctrine had not prepared them for. German military theory, forged in the experiences of the First World War and refined in the opening years of the Second, emphasized tactical excellence, operational maneuver, and the skillful use of combined arms. German soldiers were trained to be adaptable, to think independently, to overcome material deficiencies through superior tactics. The Siegfried Line's defenses were designed by men who understood infantry assault patterns, artillery tactics, and armor operations as they had existed in 1938. But what rolled against the West Wall in January 1945 was something qualitatively different: American industrial warfare, a form of combat that treated material abundance as its own form of tactics. The Americans did not need tactical elegance when they could simply bring overwhelming firepower to bear. They did not need to husband resources when replacement tanks, shells, and men arrived in steady streams. They did not need to achieve local superiority through maneuver when they could achieve it through sheer weight of material. A German intelligence report captured in February 1945 attempted to analyze American tactics along the Siegfried Line. The document, written by a Wehrmacht major attached to an infantry division that had been shattered in the fighting, noted, "The American approach defies traditional military logic. They do not seek to achieve victory through minimal expenditure of resources, but through maximal application of force. They fire 10 shells where we would fire 1. They deploy 3 tanks where we would deploy 1. They seem to possess an unlimited supply of everything: ammunition, fuel, vehicles, even food. Their soldiers eat better in the field than our officers eat in garrison. This is not merely a tactical advantage, it is a psychological weapon. Our men see the abundance of the enemy and understand that they are fighting not just an army, but an entire economic system." This observation about food, that single line about American soldiers eating better in combat than German officers ate in safety, reveals a profound truth about what the Siegfried Line defenders were experiencing. The material disparity between the two sides was so vast that it manifested in every aspect of military life. American soldiers advancing on the Siegfried Line carried K-rations that included chocolate bars, canned meat, biscuits, and instant coffee. Their field kitchens, when operational, serve hot meals with fresh bread, butter, and canned fruit. Cigarettes were issued routinely. Medical supplies were abundant. Inside the Siegfried Line bunkers, German soldiers survived on diminishing rations. The bread was often moldy. The meat was frequently spoiled. Coffee was a fantasy. They drank chicory or roasted grain substitutes. Many suffered from malnutrition-related ailments: bleeding gums from scurvy, night blindness from vitamin A deficiency, chronic diarrhea from contaminated water. When they were wounded, medical supplies were so limited that morphine was reserved only for most extreme cases. Minor wounds were dressed with paper bandages. Infections were common. The American abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a calculated strategy that recognized logistics as warfare's foundation. The United States had entered the war with an economy already geared toward industrial production and had expanded that capacity exponentially. Liberty ships were being produced at a rate that replaced losses faster than German U-boats could sink them. Truck factories in Detroit, tank plants in Ohio, ammunition factories in Alabama, the entire continental United States had become a war factory operating at peak capacity. And critically, unlike Germany, America's industrial base was beyond the reach of enemy bombers. No bombs fell on Detroit. No artillery threatened the steel mills of Pennsylvania. This disparity created a feedback loop. American forces could afford to use ammunition lavishly because they knew resupply was coming. They could afford to risk tanks in frontal assaults because replacement vehicles were en route. German forces, by contrast, had to husband every shell, every gallon of fuel, every man, because there were no replacements coming. The Wehrmacht in early 1945 was a dwindling asset, a wasting force that could only get weaker with each passing day. As Patton's tanks broke through the first line of Siegfried Line fortifications, they did not pause to consolidate. Patton's doctrine was relentless forward momentum. Bypass bunkers were left for infantry to reduce. The armor punched through, exploited gaps, and drove into the German rear. This created panic among German commanders accustomed to more methodical warfare. Defensive plans assumed that any breakthrough would be contained, that reserves could be shifted to seal gaps, that mobile counterattacks could restore the line. But Patton's forces moved faster than German command structures could respond. By the time orders were issued to shift reserves to threatened sectors, American tanks were already miles beyond those positions, cutting supply lines, overrunning headquarters, creating chaos. Captain Ernst Müller, an artillery officer whose battery was supposed to provide fire support for Siegfried Line bunkers near Bitburg, later described the psychological impact of the American breakthrough in testimony given to Allied interrogators. "We received reports that American tanks had penetrated the first line. Then we received reports they had reached the second line. Then we received no reports at all because the telephone lines were cut. We could hear the sounds of battle moving past us, behind us, all around us. We did not know where the front was anymore because the front was everywhere and nowhere. Our orders were to support the bunkers, but the bunkers had fallen or been bypassed. We fired our remaining shells in the direction of engine sounds, and then we destroyed our guns and retreated on foot because there was no fuel for our vehicles and no prospect of receiving any." This collapse of coherent defense marked the transformation of the Siegfried Line from a defensive system into a series of isolated strongpoints, each surrounded and neutralized in turn. American tactics evolved to handle this situation efficiently. Bypass bunkers were subjected to repeated artillery bombardment until they surrendered or were silenced. Engineers sealed bunker entrances with explosives, entombing defenders who refused to surrender. Flamethrower teams burned out tunnel complexes. The process was methodical, brutal, and effective. By late January 1945, entire sectors of the Siegfried Line had ceased to exist as functioning defensive positions. The dragon's teeth remained. Concrete pyramids stood as mute witnesses to engineering ambitions, but they guarded nothing. The bunkers were shattered or surrendered. The trenches were empty or filled with snow-covered bodies. The elaborate system of interlocking fire zones had been shattered into isolated pockets of resistance that fell one by one to American combined arms assaults.